Hello, hello, hello. This is the Webo Bubble, and with the second installment of my podcast, we'll be discussing isms. Um, for those, so the way I pick topics generally for these past two episodes is I see something in either written discourse or someone says something. This is the latter case, and basically the comment was all isms are bad. So there's a lot of problems with that. Obviously, we like nuance here in the Webo Bubble. It's nice. It's a nice warm feeling, the nuance. So during the 19th century, there was this movement to classify everything. And so that's where a lot of these words that end in ism, such as communism, fascism, etc., come from, is this kind of trend of naming everything ism. This also includes a lot of very benign things. So the goal was put everything in a box. They did that pretty well. Is it all bad? Well, it depends what you mean. So alphabetism is the ability to read. It's so, but then you also have communism, which is the implementation of Marxist principles through violence. So that's obviously very bad, and so there's a great dichotomy. Obviously, reading generally a good thing. Communism always bad. So what that means for us is defining the kind of examples that lead to something being bad. You know, when you have to ask yourself what is evil and what is good, it becomes very complicated because to most people, they are inherent to their time and place. So people that actually believe, violence is the solution very well might believe, oh no, communism's fine, but there are a lot of other problems with that. But an ism is just a set of a word that ends with ism is just a set of principles, ideas. They're often political or philosophical or defined specifically, like in the case of alphabetism, a practice. So rock climbing is alpinism. That's kind of like the study of, the use of mountains and alpine ways. So isms, because they often represent political organizations, ideas, etc., we find that generally they get classed as being negative. So that's if you look at the political graph, so we've got our four quadrants, right? So the top right is fascism. The top middle, which is the y-axis, 0, is authoritarianism, and then on the left side you have communism, top left, and then in bottom right you have anarcho-capitalism, or you might even call it feudalism, but not really. Then you have in the middle it's libertarian, or liberalism is the most correct. It's also an ism. And then you have in the bottom left anarchy, or anarchism is also, or syndicalism, which is an extreme form of Trotskyite socialism. But then obviously these are all bad, but then you look at it and you go, wait, these are the extremes, so of course they're bad. That's kind of, the whole concept of extreme ideas don't work very well. There's also kind of the general view that these extremes in reality are looped. Okay, so the concept is you can't really have communism because it becomes just straight up authoritarian, and it looks very fascist. And fascism has a lot of tenets of, in practice, will very tend to look like communism. So that's kind of a thing. And then obviously, as I mentioned, extreme right liberalism will lead to a very feudal-looking society because it will be corporations rather than a government that will be stratifying you. And then you'll have the undisputed rule of the employer, and that obviously it's extreme, therefore generally not a good plan. And then in anarchy or anarchism, syndicalism, you have systems that require everyone's agreement to begin, and therefore you can't ever get anything done, or you can't have society that exists on a large scale. This is problematic and generally viewed as negative. Obviously, in the United States, local government, local government generally has that more anarchist, in the much closer to the what the word means, kind of feel, because the town council can decide ordinances. They have a great deal of power over your daily life, and that required a local election, which is just the people on the small scale that are involved in your city making that decision. And then as you move up, it becomes more authoritarian. So the state government is the middle ground in the American system between the most liberal and then the most authoritarian in our structure. Now, obviously, liberalism and authoritarianism aren't necessarily bad when kept in moderation. Medicine generally is that way. So for authoritarianism, that's things like a quarantine, closing borders to make sure that infected individuals couldn't get in. Obviously, we didn't do that for this last pandemic, but it's still very much how that could have been done, and that's authoritarianism. Also, authoritarianism, that more authoritarian, not necessarily the totality or the logical conclusion to authoritarian thought of police, fire, EMS, traffic laws, making sure people wear their seatbelts to keep them safe. Things like this, while we agree that it takes away from personal freedoms, ensures safety, versus liberalism, it gives us things like freedom of speech, being able to criticize the government. This is fairly important. Freedom of religion, also fairly important to a lot of people. Freedom of expression, association, etc. And then on the left side of the spectrum, you have social services, because you say, well, poor people need help, and we generally agree that some level of social services are required. We might say that the social services need to be handled differently, but that's the kind of idea of a two-party system, is that the two parties are so monolithic, they agree that the change that needs to happen, they just have different paths to get there. That's kind of the thought process. And obviously, liberalism and republicanism and authoritarianism are all words that live happily together, because republicanism is the set of practices of a republic, and you could probably call democratic practices democratism, but I wouldn't. I would just call it democracy. That seems a lot easier. And part of why people think isms are bad is that then we have all these words like racism, ableism, fascism, communism. No, I don't say socialism, to kind of define these negative ideas. But what we don't talk about is, well, those are basically just, instead of, like in science, we have ology, right? We have this, which means the study of, so biology, the study of life, geology, the study of the earth, hydrology, the study of water, things like that. Then we have, in social sciences, we have history, philosophy, things like this, which means to look at the past, right? And then we have, then we just have isms, which then get a bad rep because they're a monolithic group that most people don't know all of the good ones for. Again, like, republicanism. Generally, being a republic is a pretty good survival strategy for a government system, right? So that's definitely positive, unless you're like an autocrat, and then you don't like those. There are obviously different kind of words that have lost a lot of meaning. So why I don't say socialism in the list of negative isms is because socialism is predicated on peaceful implementation of Marxist principles. So the problem we have with communism is not that it's trying to implement Marxist principles. We here have no opinion. We only have a problem with its violence. If it wasn't violent, it would be non-problematic. Now, you might look at certain policies from states claiming to be communist, and then you could say, well, this was inherently violent, so is it socialist? Well, yes, it's closer to socialism. Can we then try it in our society? Well, if you do it peacefully, yes, but a lot of people, they don't like talking about the differences between them, because one, that makes it complicated, and nuance is hard. But also socialism as a concept is very much more associated with things like this USSR, and people then say, well, look, it has socialist in the name there, it was socialist. To which I retort, the DRC, or Democratic Republic of the Congo, is it then must be the most forward-thinking place on earth, and the Kingdom of Denmark, or the Empire of Denmark, which has some still possessions, technically speaking, must be the most authoritarian. And then you would be surprised at the answer there. Yes. So the other problem with looking at isms and different things in a totally negative light is then there's this thing called satirism, or to use it in a more common form of the word, satire. So satirism is the practices of creating satire, right? So that's irony, that's any way you're trying to make an opponent's argument look absurd. And some people think, well, satirism has to be funny, and therefore then all these other like more serious works of satire, and then for satirism, are negative because I don't understand that satire can be dark, like Fahrenheit 451, or Huckleberry Finn being one of those more banned examples of dark satire, with Huck's father as a character being very much a satirical tool. Now, the other problem with satire is a lot of people don't like to talk about it because there's this modern concept of the death of the author, wherein each author, as soon as they publish the work, can't influence it anymore, and therefore people will take away their own message. So if the satire is overtly obvious and undeniable, it's hard for people to pick up on, and therefore the author has failed to ensure that that viewpoint has been continued to carry on. Hence, you'll run into a lot of situations in which people will not understand satire. The best example I can think of is the very dark satire of Starship Troopers, which was not seen at the time, partially because the original novel, the source material, is actually very pro-militarist. Not necessarily pro-fascist, but it's most likely a fascist government. Now, there are screw-ups in Starship Troopers because there is it's a fascist regime that allows its government to be quote-unquote criticized. Although, depending on how you analyze the film, you could say, well, isn't this a film that they would have liked to have produced, and therefore they would like to show that, look, you can satirize the government, you can talk bad about the government, but in reality, that system would never allow that. And I think that you can make a very good argument for that. And I think the producer of the film would also probably agree with you. Now, it was funny because he got called a fascist, and then you remember, wait, didn't he grow up in the Netherlands as it was under Nazi occupation? And then, yes, he did. So that's cool. His name was Van Heim, if I recall correctly. Yes, he's very Dutch or Belgian. I can't remember. He's one of the two, but it comes up every once in a while. And then you have, these other isms that are totally benign. Obviously, albitism, which I keep mentioning. But then you have others, like the list of isms, because they were trying in the 19th century to put almost everything in a physical, defined lines, which also doesn't work because obviously there's a blend somewhere between fascism and racism. There's a mix. You can't just say, well, these are two distinct boxes and nothing and never the twain shall cross, right? You can look at Nazi Germany and you can say, well, that was fascist and very racist and very ableist and all these other things that were and are associated with these isms and these concepts that are extremely negative. And then the 19th century would say, yes, but they have to be one or the other. And por qué no las dos, as we say in the business. But then you also have these kind of concepts of larger development issues, right? So you can't just look at word usages in their actual definition, because there's something called the totality of circumstance, and the vernacular has changed. So with words like socialism, because were associated with communism, they have gained a lot of the negative aspects in the spoken vernacular, right? So you can't just say, well, but look at the dictionary definition. You have to acknowledge the fact that this is what most people talk about when they're talking about socialism, is actually much more authoritarian than what they think the technical definition of the word means. And a lot of people that advocate for socialist principles are advocating for the friendly kind of socialism. I would say socialism with a human face, but that was movement in the Eastern Bloc post, very close to the end of the Soviet Union, and it didn't work. So we won't bring that up too much. But we would also, when we talk about socialism, especially in the American democratic system, we're not talking about democratic socialists. We're talking about social democrats. And changing two words, it doesn't sound like it would have a big impact, but it really does, because a social democrat believes in democracy first, versus a democratic socialist believes that rather than having a more authoritarian style of extreme left rule, you have a more liberal style of extreme left rule. So it's still it's much more likely to make a statement that you don't believe in, like a premier and different things like that, and having more decentralized power, but you're still in that system that has, to a much greater extent, embraced socialist ideals. No one is, even Bernie Sanders, advocating for the total acceptance of socialism, because we obviously will continue to have currency, which even the Soviet Union never managed to get rid of. We're going to have religious freedom. We're not going to be like, we still like our alcohol, but people are like, well, what does alcohol have to do with socialism? So part of the original concept of socialism, especially Lenin socialism, is sobriety, and because of what the Tsar was using vodka for, which was to keep kind of cheap vodka, so that there was this ecstasy for the masses, that they could drown their sorrows. And you look at that and you go, wait a second, then Stalin brought the vodka back, and you're like, different system, right? So originally socialism as a concept had a lot of these very prohibition, temperance kind of leanings. And so is that bad? Well, yes and no. Obviously, Lenin pretended to be socialist. Well, you can make a very good argument that he was not, due to secret police. That's generally not what's associated with a free society that has embraced socialism. Now, then you have these other groups that, aside from this digression we talk about, right, which have autarkic systems, and they're autarkic anarchism. So, right, autarky is a weird word. It's an old word meaning self-sufficiency. So different words that have value to society sometimes don't stay around. And autarky, because it's so rarely used, has very little value, so it kind of has fallen by the wayside. But it basically means self-sufficiency. And then so autarkic anarchism is the belief that we will have basically a very small commune. We're only going to have like a couple hundred people, so we can't all sit together and have long discussions, because it will not affect anything larger than our immediate community, which is fine if you live in a place like Andorra or Switzerland, or some of these other microstates where you can much more effectively redistribute wealth, and you can people won't be greedy because they'll know everyone, and then you have a problem if you have a negative exercise outcome, where if someone's concentrating the wealth and it's 5 against 1, well, he's going to lose all of his wealth. But then you also have like where that falls apart in different things. But then you go into the kind of concept of anarchism as, well, we don't want people that aren't in our community telling us how to run our community. And that's not inherently negative as a concept. It can be a little bit dangerous when you take it to the logical extreme. In Republican Spain, the anarchists tried really hard at the beginning of the Civil War, but they never were really able to create a effective force, because they were not willing to be more in the early war. But late war, the Soviet Union and the communists were screwing everything up, because they were infighting amongst their own groups. Before concentrating on the fascists, because it was an ideological struggle within extreme left ideology versus necessarily fighting against fascism. Now, that's not to say the Spanish Civil War was fascist versus communist, because it wasn't. It was much more of a national war. There's a lot more factions that were directly involved than the foreign aid, even though it's portrayed as very much being a fascist versus communist conflict. I would suggest the readings by this guy. You might know him. His name is George Orwell, he wrote an Homage to Catalonia, if I recall correctly. And yeah, he was kind of a big deal, and his thoughts on fascism and all these other things, and why you can kind of see with the Homage to Catalonia why the different factions were fighting and how complicated all these factions were, and why it wasn't a fascism versus communism conflict. But then also you have in general why this never came across, and why it becomes very difficult to teach that narrative. So we teach isms are bad, and people then get that stuck in their head, because then they can't look and say, well, actually it was Catholicism, which can be bad or good, and losing power, and the king losing power, and then these other groups that were trade unions wanting to support power, and then there were some other basically guild organizations, and then there was looting and all these, and there was North African shenanigans going on in the Rift, and some other things that really did affect why this conflict was not as simple as it's taught. And that's, that the simplicity of teaching isms, because we don't teach where they come from, we don't teach how broad of a range there are, then leads to the statement that I saw, which sparked my whole very disjointed line of reasoning, which is no, isms aren't bad. There's just a very, very long list of them. Now, the other problem with isms, for the uninitiated, is isms are based very much in a technical understanding. As we said, with communism is the implementation of Marxist principles through violence. Well, that's very technical. Fascism, as a technical definition, is basically an authoritarian, ultranationalist regime characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, so on and so forth. You also have very regimented society, and an economy that looks very planned and very much like a socialist or communist economy, because they need to plan it, because that works so well all the time. You can definitely know how many rolls of toilet paper you're going to need in 10 years. That'll definitely not change based on exterior factors or people panicking and requesting more, or things like that. You can definitely do that. Anyway, the kind of takeaway, though, I would like people to have with all this history and historiography, and kind of thinking about isms is a very broad category, which is effectively a way of defining a set of practices. This is just generally how things have gone. There are writings that kind of will tell you why they're complicated, but they're not going to really give you the full list. I did Google it. There is a huge list of all the isms out there, and you can tell just by going by that, most of them are pretty benign. The larger issue, obviously, is still that you have these individuals who think that, because I was taught in school, communism and fascism are bad, and these are the only isms that I really know, especially because we kept authoritarianism at the top of that political chart from earlier, and we've replaced liberalism with libertarian, and we'd like to then hold up liberal values or libertarian values or neoliberalism or classical liberalism, however you want to call it, as the association with freedom, or the association currently with the progressive movement, even though they're not the same, which is progressivism versus liberalism versus conservatism is a whole other thing. But if we need to then recontextualize how we teach people what the ending ism means, in order to kind of change it. Anyways, this has been Ramblings About Isms by the Webo Bubble, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.